Okay, welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to explain why Labour is crushing your living standards. Okay, so if you are watching this video on Sunday the 30th of March, which is when it's going to go out, or shortly afterwards, you will be watching in the immediate aftermath of Labour's spring statement. The news will have been absolutely covered in discussion of things like fiscal rules and government bond rates and forecasts for growth. And you'll probably be expecting that I will do something on the spring statement. But to be honest, at times like this, when we have these kind of theatrical, political set plays, I often get frustrated with the way the media has a kind of a fixation with nailing in on the specific details. Which tax has he risen? Or which tax has she risen? Which spending has she cut? And there's very often very little discussion of what is actually happening in the big picture. Why is Labour choosing to do Austerity 2.0? What are the reasons driving basically the need for Labour to do this? Why are they being forced to do this? When I was a trader, one of the first things which I found really interesting was that you very quickly realize as a trader that the things which are portrayed as important on the news are very often not important for traders at all. And the things which are important for traders in the markets are very often not shown in the news at all. So you have a situation where the news likes these kind of set plays like budgets, spring statements, but really what matters for traders, the economy, for your living standards are what are the big picture long-term changes in the economy. So what I want to do today is I want to explain why it is that Labour is doing Austerity 2.0, why Labour is cutting spending, cutting benefits, raising taxes on workers. Why is Labour crushing your living standards? So I was very pessimistic about Labour before the election. I was very confident that they would basically fail to significantly grow the economy, that they would preside over falling living standards. And I thought there was always a significant risk that they would basically move into this Austerity 2.0 space. And the reason for this is because I understood the big picture trend, which has dominated the economy really for the last 20 years, really, but especially for the last 5 years since COVID, which I am calling the squeeze out. The squeeze out of the working class, the squeeze out of the middle class, the squeeze out of the government. And in this video, we're going to go through nice and slowly in detail what the squeeze out is and how it affects you. Okay, so the squeeze out really is kind of a new way of framing something that I've been speaking about for a long time. But I've been really moving towards this kind of framing recently. And I think it's a really powerful way to explain to ordinary people what's happening and how it affects them. So on this channel, I speak a lot about wealth inequality, but I think wealth inequality as a concept can sound a little bit academic. It can sound a little bit idealistic, egalitarian. People can kind of think this is politics of envy. How does that affect me? And I think the squeeze out is a focus on really the most damaging and most dangerous direct consequence of wealth inequality for ordinary people, which is that the rich accumulate an enormous amount of money and they use that to outcompete other groups in society, such as the working class and the middle class, for assets. Meaning that over time, the working class and the middle class have less and less and less assets and go further and further and further into debt. And to be honest, it was an understanding of this phenomenon which actually led me to become interested in wealth inequality in the first place. When I was a trader in the aftermath of 2008, everybody was predicting a strong economic recovery, but I couldn't help but notice that ordinary families were getting poorer and poorer year after year, generation after generation, and so would the government. And this was basically what led me to understanding that inequality is important. So if we reframe and focus instead of wealth inequality itself and on the squeezing out of the working class and the middle class, I think it makes it a lot more visceral and powerful for ordinary people, ordinary families like you, because you start to see what this means is me and my family are going to lose our wealth. We're going to lose our houses. We're going to get driven into debt. Okay, so what I'm going to do from now is basically a nice historical lesson of the history of wealth inequality. I'm going to focus mainly on this country in the UK. And we're going to talk about how ordinary families got wealth and how they got squeezed out and are being squeezed out. Okay, so first some historical context. The period 70 years after World War II is not historically normal, and it's not internationally normal. During that period of 70 years, we saw a lot of ordinary people, a lot of ordinary families, people earning average or even less than average incomes, being able to own homes without significant debt, get things like pensions, basically own a chunk of the wealth. That is not common. If you go to most of the world, to be honest, outside Europe and North America, if you go to most countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, what you see is small, very wealthy elites and a very small middle class below that. And then most people don't own significant wealth. What they own is worth very little, and they live in poverty. And that was true in Europe and in this country, the UK, and in the United States for most of history as well. And that is basically, to be honest, that is the long-term history of sort of post-agricultural human civilizations, is you tend to have a small elite and a lot of poverty around them. In the history of this country, the UK, you do have sort of a couple of historical examples when working people were able to get themselves a little bit more power and a little bit more wealth after the plague, after the Black Death, when 50% of the population of Europe died. Working people were a bit more needed. They were able to get a little bit more of a share. You were able to see women get a bit more of a share than they did historically at that point in time. During the Industrial Revolution, you had a period where basically all of the world's production was happening in a small part of northwestern Europe. And after a lot of fighting, ordinary working people were again able to get a bit of a share. But even then, realistically, these societies lived in very high levels of inequality, most of the wealth owned by a super elite. But in the 20th century, this all changed, basically. People sometimes forget that even at the beginning of the 20th century, the 1900s, there was still really, really widespread poverty and extreme inequality, even in this country, the UK. My grandmother, who was born in the 20s, saw, I think, 3 or 4 of her siblings die of tuberculosis, which is basically a preventable disease of poverty. Yeah, people lived in desperate poverty in the early 20th century. But during and immediately after World War II, there was really significant change here. And what you see, if you compare pre-World War II to post-World War II, is suddenly a massive increase in wealth holding of the government, and some of that wealth being held by the middle class, and eventually even significant amounts of working class wealth. So I often talk about how my dad worked for the post office, making 20 grand a year, less than average wage, and he was able to buy property, things like that. So what you see is suddenly this historic wealth dynamic of the rich owning everything changes in the 20th century. And I think the key to that is basically World War II. I think World War II sees basically like a big shift in the ownership of wealth. And to be honest, I would like to understand a little bit more about exactly how that wealth shifts during World War II from being owned by the rich to being owned by the government and by ordinary people. I'll be looking into it. I've got my theories. Probably we'll get an expert in to speak about it one day. I think it's interesting to consider because at the moment, when there is a lot of attention on can we tax the rich, people sometimes forget that the 20th century is a really good example of the fact that wealth can be redistributed. It doesn't just have to flow one way. It can flow back to ordinary people. But what you need to know for now is essentially World War II saw a really historic shift in who owns the wealth. And it was no longer owned just by a small elite, and it was suddenly owned in large part by the government and by the middle class and by the working class. And in the period 30, 40 years after World War II, this kind of stayed relatively unchanged. And this was largely because in that period we had very, very high rates of tax on rich people, which essentially prevented the flow of wealth, which I talk about a lot on this channel, from happening. So whenever you have inequality, you have this kind of problematic, monopoly game style situation, which is these guys own the assets, these guys don't, you have to pay your salary to them, and over time, that wealth difference grows and grows and grows. But in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we had very high rates of tax on the richest, which basically prevented the rich from accumulating money and buying up the assets. Then in the 80s, you have the Thatcher in this country, Reagan in the US governments come in and basically totally rewrite the story around economics. Lots of people don't like Thatcher and Reagan, but I think when you look back at what they did, we can kind of view them as a hopeful example that tax policies can be changed, distributions can be changed, the story about economics can be changed. And these guys basically changed the story. I will add that's what we're trying to do on this channel, basically, change the story about economics. Thatcher and Reagan came in, they changed the story on economics, and they massively slashed taxation on the richest people. And as soon as you do that, that's when the squeeze out begins. And we enter stage one of the squeeze out. Okay, so part one of the squeeze out. Taxes have been cut on rich people in the 80s, and suddenly rich people start to accumulate a lot of money. Now, one key feature of rich people, which I speak about a lot on the channel, is that rich people have what economists call a low marginal propensity to consume. What that means is if you give rich people a lot of money, they will not increase their consumption significantly. What they will do instead is they will start to buy significantly assets. So the rich get a lot of money, they start buying assets. The first thing you see is asset prices rising. You start to see stock markets going up, and you start to see house prices going up. What's interesting about this is most people perceive this stage one as a really good thing. So, we're existing in this post-war economy where lots of people, even poorer people, own assets, and they start to see their house price go up, or they start to see their stock holdings go up. If you're in a country where, like the US or Germany, where people own stocks, people are really excited. Like, my house price is going up, stock price is going up. Like, this is really, really good. And I think what people don't realize is those rising stock prices and those rising house prices are basically a manifestation of the rich starting to squeeze people out of asset holding. And what you will see first is the very poorest people will respond to these increased asset prices by selling their assets. And I think the first thing that you saw was, in particular, older people from poorer families using that, I suppose, asset windfall to give themselves more comfortable retirements. I want to point out, comfortable retirements are not a historical or an international norm, but this is a thing which we started to get, in particular, in this first stage of the squeeze out. So if you're poor, you've lived a poor life, and suddenly you see your house price going up, what you are probably going to do is you're going to say, okay, this is great. I'm going to use that increased price to give myself a little bit of luxury, a little bit of comfort in my retirement. And what this means is the first stage of the squeeze out, it feels great even for the poor, especially if you own property. You're like, my asset price is going up, I'm going to sell the asset and I'm going to live a better life. So what you see is, in the first stage, the rich are accumulating money, but they are not using that to outcompete the poor or the middle class for consumption, which means living standards don't fall for ordinary people. What they are doing is they are using it to squeeze the weakest hands, which is the historical working class, out of ownership of assets, out of ownership of property. Now that goes on, and eventually you start to see property prices are going up and up and up. Poorer families eventually over time are owning less and less housing. I think a really good example of this is the Right to Buy scheme here in the UK, which is when the UK government sold off its housing to poorer people, and those poorer people owned their houses for a bit, eventually sold them in order to fund decent retirements, and ended up owning nothing. Now the properties are owned by rich people and they're buy-to-let properties, and the poor end up with the government having no assets and themselves having no assets. This is a really, really good example of how in stage one of the squeeze out, asset prices get pushed up and up and up and up and up, and that squeezes out the weakest hands in society, who are in the first place the working class. But the working class often, and this is not just the working class, the squeezed out class often enjoys it because they are able to consume more while they are dissaving their wealth. And they often don't look down the line and think, what's going to happen when we don't have any wealth left? So what you see here is weaker and weaker hands dissaving their assets, getting poorer and poorer in wealth terms, but using that to sustain a good quality of life. And I think I'll just make it clear what dissaving is. Dissaving is, I have some wealth and I'm gonna, for a period of time, spend more than my income by basically selling the wealth that I have to the rich, or by taking on debt. So dissaving is really a key concept to understanding the squeeze out, which is, I have some assets, over time I sell them to the rich, and that enables me to live a good quality of life while I'm being squeezed out. So you kind of have people cheering on their own demise in a sense. But over time, less and less and less poor people own homes. The asset price goes up and up. Rich people are accumulating more wealth and accumulating more money. And you reach a situation where the only way for, especially the working class, but also often the middle class, to own homes, to compete with the rich for ownership of homes, is to borrow the money from the rich. So you're seeing less ownership of property and increasing levels of debt, increasing size of mortgages. And this keeps happening. The rich get richer and richer and richer. House prices go up and up and up and up. Levels of debt increase and increase and increase. And eventually you reach a point where the rich are looking at the poor and the middle class and they're saying, well, you don't have any assets anymore. You are in a massive amount of debt to us. We don't think you are creditworthy anymore. And that is when you enter stage 2 of the squeeze out. So when we get to stage 2, you have this problem where basically a big chunk of society can't borrow money anymore. And this happens in 2008. So up until 2008, a big chunk of society is getting squeezed out, but they're able to still spend because the rich are lending to them. They basically reach the point where the rich says they're no longer a good credit. Let's stop lending to them. And that is when you enter an economic crisis. Suddenly the lending is not there. This means a massive chunk of society can't afford to spend, and you essentially enter an economic depression. People can't spend, businesses shut down. That means even more people can't spend. And that is for the first point in the squeeze out, when the rich are not only taking your assets, but they start to basically not allow you to consume. And what this of course means is there's a massive increase in poverty. Suddenly people lose their job, people can't borrow, people can't spend, there's a massive economic depression, and that means that governments have to step in. So here in Western Europe, we generally live in welfare states where the governments have a kind of theoretical responsibility to make sure that the majority of their populations stay out of poverty. But the majority of the population, by the beginning of stage 2, they've got no wealth, they've got no power, they basically have no way to keep themselves out of poverty. So governments step in. But the government has a problem, which is the rich are getting richer and richer and richer and richer. They have the assets. This group of people, the working class, they've got nothing. The government needs the assets from the rich to support the working class. But unfortunately, the government has been very reluctant to tax the rich. So they turn around to the rich and they say, what do you want in order for you to allow the poor to live, to have a good quality of life? And the rich basically say to the government the same thing that they said to the poor, which was, we want your assets and we'll lend you the money. And then you see basically the exact same thing happening to government, which happened to the poor in stage 1, which is the government gradually sells off its assets, government dissaving essentially. Asset prices start to go up again because the rich are getting richer and richer and richer. And I think it's worth noting that after 2008, even though the initial move was a crash in asset prices, there was then a massive increase in asset prices. The government are put in the same situation that the working class are in. The only way they can support living standards for the working class is to sell their assets and to take debt. And the government gets poorer and poorer and poorer, fewer and fewer assets, and more and more and more and more debt. And I think we'll try and flash up a graph of Thomas Piketty's data on the wealth of governments, which has massively, massively collapsed in the last 20 years. So what you see on this graph is a graph by the French economist Thomas Piketty looking at the wealth levels, total amount of assets versus total amount of debt of all of the world's biggest governments. And what you see here is the US and also European governments, basically the wealth has collapsed all the way to zero. It's worth noting that this graph stops before COVID, and in COVID, these wealth levels collapsed. So what you have now is a situation where basically Western governments are not only zero wealth, they're actually massively in negative wealth. And this is a perfect example of the government being squeezed out, just like the poor were. So what you have there is basically stage 2 and stage 3 of the squeeze out. Stage 2 is the economic depression. Ordinary people can't spend. Suddenly there is a collapse in consumption, a first collapse in living standards. And stage 3 is the government stepping in, the government supporting living standards, but the government gradually itself getting squeezed out. Eventually, when the government runs out of wealth and is too far in debt to borrow any further, that is when we enter stage 4. So stage 4 is basically where we are now, and I think stage 4 perfectly explains what is happening now to the UK government, what increasingly will happen to the US government, what increasingly will happen to European governments, which is the government has tried to step in to protect the poor who are having their wealth squeezed out by this rapidly growing wealth of the rich. And as a result of doing that, they have had their own wealth squeezed out, and now they have no wealth left either. And they are left in a situation where there's basically nothing they can do. Well, there is one thing they could do. They could tax the rich, but whilst that is off the table, they really simply have no choice but to shut down the welfare states, because we are moving back to that pre-World War II period where all of the wealth, all of the assets, all of the power are held by the rich. The working class have nothing left. The government have nothing left. They have no wealth in order to provide you with the things which they are supposed to provide you. So what you see, and what we have seen in the last 10, 15 years, and what we will see more aggressively in the next 10 years, is basically the shutting down of government. So you see the closing of local services, you see the aggressive contraction of welfare, you see the defunding of the courts and the defunding of the police, and eventually the defunding of things like education and healthcare. We saw the defunding of social housing a long time ago. Basically, because the government have been squeezed out, they have no choice but to basically shut down all of these services. And I think this is the part of the discussion which is never really spoken about by economists and never really spoken about in the media. I think what you will have seen, and we're shooting this before the Spring Statement came out, by the way, but what you will have seen is the government, the media talking a lot about fiscal rules without really recognizing the underlying reality, which is all of the wealth has gone increasingly to a small elite. And that means that the government really, if they are not willing to tax the elite with that wealth, the only option they have is to try and squeeze as much as they can the one remaining section of society which has a bit of wealth and has a bit of power, which is the middle class. And that is kind of what the government is doing. They're trying to fill this middle gap of, we're going to tax the middle class because they're the only guys with wealth. We're going to try to borrow from the rich. But really all that does is further squeeze out the next weakest hand, which is the middle class, and further enrich the guys who are doing the squeezing, which is the rich. And then you end up in a situation which I think increasingly we are coming into and we will come into, where basically nobody has any wealth except for the rich. And then what you start to see is the physical transformation of society, which is we have lived for the last 70 years in middle class, working class societies. And what I mean by that is we have lived in societies which unusually have provided things such as good quality housing and education and healthcare and goods and services to the middle class and the working class, but those guys have no wealth and no power anymore. So you need to change what you produce, you need to change the physical shape of your economy, and you need to stop producing things for the working class, stop producing things for the middle class, and start producing only for the rich. And I think a couple good historical examples of these are the famous potato famine in Ireland, where basically food was being grown in Ireland and exported to rich people who, while the Irish died because they were poor. I think of the famines in India, where people were dying in India because the fields were growing tea that was being sent halfway across the world. I think another great example of that is Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast goes to Africa. He spends $500 to give a kid their eyesight back forever. The reason that that kid doesn't have his eyesight is because he lives in a very unequal country. He is a member of the poor class. He does not get anything. He's been fully squeezed out. The resources that he needs to get his eyesight back are being used by the rich, and he can't compete with them. So you need to move into a completely transformed society which does not produce anything for the poor, for the middle class. I think the best example you can see of that, especially here where I live, is housing. So I grew up in Ilford, in East London. It was a working class street we grew up in. It was quite a working class town. Lots of small families living in small terraced houses, but it was respectable, it was dignified, there was a degree of space. And if you go back to Ilford now, you will see that physical transformation, which is all of those houses have been expanded up, they've been expanded back, they're rented out by the room, quality of life is very low, it's basically a slum. There's all of these enormous blocks of tiny, tiny flats, which have very low standard of living inside them. And what you are seeing here is the building of the slum. And if you go into central London, you will see these unbelievably luxurious flats being built everywhere. You will see luxurious restaurants, luxurious hotels, luxurious bars, absolutely full of rich people, because rich people have taken all the wealth, they've squeezed everyone else out, and they are taking all the resources. So this is it really. This is what is dominating the government situation, which is not getting spoken about much, which is weak hands are being progressively squeezed out of our society. I think if you're from the working class, if you're from a poor family, you've been able to see that for a while. If you're from a more middle class situation, you might not have realized it's coming for you. But this is the way that it goes. The working class gets squeezed out first, then the government gets squeezed out, then the middle class gets squeezed out, and eventually you move to this kind of South Africa style, Brazil style, India style economy where everything is owned by the rich and no one else has anything left. This is what is dominating our political narrative, and unless the government does something about this squeeze out, there will be basically nothing that they can do, and this will simply go further and further. It will get worse and worse. I think it's interesting to ask, what do the rich do once they've squeezed everybody else out? Because at this point they will have enormous amounts of passive income. There'll be no weak hands to squeeze out of the economy. The only thing that they can do with their enormous income, their enormous wealth, their enormous resources, is try to squeeze out each other. And historically, that basically means war. The rich have everything, they want more. The only people you can take from are the rich people. And this is the history of Europe, and World War II essentially was the climax of it, the Holocaust, the nuclear bombing of Japan. This basically was the logical endpoint of the continual squeeze out, which is the rich take more, the rich take more, the rich take more, the rich take more. And eventually you have nothing and you're worthless and you can be used as a pawn in a war. But we're not there yet. What I want to talk about right now is how this is relevant to the statement that came out in the week, which is the government is essentially rowing a boat with a massive hole in the bottom. Your wealth is being squeezed out. You are losing your power. The government is losing wealth and power. The rich are getting richer and richer and richer every day. And the reality of that is you simply have to get poorer. You are losing your relative position in society. And until you, the working class, the middle classes of the UK, the US, and the government are willing to start putting that in reverse, there simply is no alternative other than to shut the welfare state down and to basically drive yourself into poverty. Okay, so to recap, the squeeze out is why the government is destroying your living standards. It's why you and your family and your kids will be increasingly poor. There are 5 stages of the squeeze out. Stage 1, the rich start to accumulate money. They drive asset prices up and they outcompete the working class for resources, and they drive the working class into debt. Stage 2, the working class have run out of resources. They can no longer borrow anymore. They can no longer spend anymore. You get an economic depression and a crisis. That's when the government has to step in. Stage 3, the government increasingly runs out of resources as well. The government too becomes massively in debt to the rich. That's when we enter stage 4. The government has no choice but to slowly eviscerate the middle class. Eventually there is no wealth left other than that held by the rich, and the physical structure of your society changes such that it only supports consumption for rich people. At this point, almost everybody in the country lives in desperate poverty. Stage 5, there are no weak hands left to be squeezed out. The rich own everything, and the only way they can try to grow their wealth is by sending you to fight in their wars against each other. So, another characteristically depressing video from Gary's Economics. Listen, I want to make it clear. Your grandparents fought for a better settlement, and they got a better settlement. They lived in a world where there was desperate, widespread poverty, and they fought for something better, and they got something better. They understood the only way to do that was to tax the rich. We're campaigning on this channel to tax wealth, not work. We are reaching out to the guys at Labour. We would love them to talk to us about policy. This will get worse. Until the government gets serious about taxing the rich, there's basically nothing they can do. I'm going to try to make them serious about it, and your support is the only power that I have. So support the channel, share it with your friends, share it with the family, send it to your mum, send it to Rachel Reeves. Maybe she's interested. If you lose all your wealth, you lose all your power, and you lose everything else. Stop the squeeze out. Take the wealth back. Tax wealth, not work. Thank you.